In this episode, we take a close look at how new AI-enabled processes can quietly create control gaps in the workforce, even when everyone believes they are being responsible. New learners often think of controls as technical things like passwords or encryption, but many of the most important controls in AI governance live in people's routines. A control gap happens when a process changes faster than the expectations, training, and oversight that are supposed to keep it safe. When AI is added to a workflow, tasks shift, decision points move, and sometimes the most important checkpoints disappear without anyone intentionally removing them. That is how unmanaged risk shows up in production, not always through dramatic failures, but through small process changes that make harmful outcomes more likely. The goal here is to learn how to spot those workforce control gaps early, before they become normal habits that are hard to correct, and to understand why these gaps are predictable rather than mysterious. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A helpful way to think about workforce controls is to picture them as the invisible guardrails built into how work gets done. Guardrails include review steps, approval steps, separation of duties, escalation paths, and clarity about who owns decisions. When AI enters a process, people may assume the tool provides extra safety because it sounds intelligent, but tools often increase speed and confidence more than they increase correctness. If speed increases while guardrails remain the same, the system may be fine, but if speed increases and guardrails weaken, the chance of harm rises. A workforce control gap is not always the absence of a rule. It can be the absence of a habit, such as routinely checking assumptions or routinely documenting why a decision was made. Beginners should notice that governance fails when people cannot explain how a decision happened or why it was considered safe. Spotting gaps means asking where the old process relied on human judgment and verification and whether the new process still provides a reliable way to do that work. One common control gap appears when an AI-enabled process turns a doer into a reviewer without giving the reviewer the time, criteria, or authority to review well. In many workflows, the person who produced the work also understood the context deeply, which made error detection easier. When AI produces the first draft, the human role becomes checking, but checking is harder than it sounds because it requires focus and specific standards. If a process expects review but does not define what to check for, review becomes a quick glance, and quick glances are not effective controls. This is a gap created by role redesign, where the control exists in theory but fails in practice. Beginners should look for signs that review is being treated as a formality, such as vague approval language or decisions made without recorded rationale. A process that relies on shallow review creates a predictable pathway to overtrust and harmful outcomes. Another control gap shows up when decision boundaries become unclear because AI makes it easy to blur where suggestion ends and decision begins. A tool might be described as decision support, but teams may begin treating its outputs as the default answer, especially when they feel pressure to move quickly. If the process does not explicitly state when a human must intervene, when a second opinion is required, or when escalation is mandatory, then the boundary becomes whatever the team feels is convenient. That convenience often shifts over time, because once a tool seems to work most of the time, people stop questioning it. Beginners should recognize that unclear boundaries are a control gap because they remove predictable checkpoints. A strong process includes clear rules about which outputs can be acted on directly and which outputs require additional review. When those rules are missing or not reinforced, the process quietly becomes more automated than anyone admits, increasing both likelihood and impact of harm. Data handling is another area where AI-enabled processes create workforce control gaps that are easy to miss. People may start copying and pasting information into prompts because it feels like normal work, without realizing they have crossed a data boundary. If the process does not define what data is allowed, what data is prohibited, and what to do when unsure, then the control is left to individual judgment. Individual judgment is unreliable under stress, and it varies widely across experience levels. A gap also appears when people assume internal use is safe and therefore feel less cautious about what they share. Beginners should look for whether the workflow includes an explicit step to consider data sensitivity before using AI, and whether that step is supported by simple guidance. If a process expects good data decisions but provides no training, no reminders, and no easy escalation path, the process is not controlled. In practice, that means data exposure becomes a matter of habit, not governance. Change control gaps are especially common when AI-enabled processes evolve rapidly, because teams adjust prompts, templates, and usage patterns without treating those changes as meaningful. Many organizations have change control for software, but they do not always treat changes in how AI is used as changes that require review. If a team expands a tool from internal drafting to customer-facing messaging, that change can increase impact dramatically. If a team starts using new data sources, the risk profile can shift quickly. If the process does not require reassessment when intended use changes, the organization can drift into higher-risk behavior without any formal decision. Beginners should notice that workforce control gaps often hide inside informal process tweaks, like a manager saying we are going to use this tool for more tasks now. Without a trigger that forces a pause and review, those tweaks become permanent, and the process becomes uncontrolled. Spotting this gap means asking what changes would require approval and whether the workflow actually enforces that requirement. A related gap appears when accountability and ownership are not updated to match the new process. When tasks shift, ownership should shift or at least be clarified, but many organizations forget to do that. A team may start relying on AI outputs to make decisions, yet no one is clearly accountable for the outcomes, the limitations, and the monitoring. If something goes wrong, people may argue about who owned the decision, the tool, or the data, and that delay increases harm. Beginners should see that ownership is a workforce control, because clear ownership creates clear responsibility for maintaining guardrails. A control gap exists when a process introduces new decision points but does not assign decision authority and escalation paths for those points. Another gap exists when the process creates new responsibilities, like monitoring or review, but does not allocate time or authority to perform them. A process without updated ownership is like a machine with missing labels on the switches, because people will flip the wrong switch under pressure. Monitoring and feedback controls also commonly weaken when AI is introduced, because teams focus on getting value and assume the tool will keep working. If a process does not include routine checks for quality, drift, and harm signals, problems can accumulate silently. Workforce control gaps here can include missing habits like reviewing sample outputs, tracking complaints, or documenting incidents and near misses. A process might have monitoring expectations on paper, but if no one owns them or if the outputs are never reviewed, monitoring becomes ceremonial. Beginners should notice that the purpose of monitoring is not collecting data, but triggering action when risk signals appear. If the workflow does not define what triggers action, who acts, and what the response looks like, then monitoring cannot reduce impact. Many AI harms are not detected by traditional security alerts, so workforce-based signals like user reports and quality checks become even more important. When those signals are ignored or underused, the process becomes less safe over time. A workforce control gap can also appear through training mismatches, where people are expected to follow a process they were never prepared to follow. If users are told to avoid certain behaviors but are not taught how to recognize risky situations, they will not comply consistently. If reviewers are expected to evaluate risk evidence but are not taught what good evidence looks like, their reviews will vary widely. If managers are expected to enforce scope boundaries but are not trained on what counts as scope creep, they may approve expansions casually. Beginners should see that training is a control because it shapes behavior, and missing training is a predictable gap. Spotting this gap means comparing what the process requires against what people actually know and practice. It also means looking for signs of confusion, such as repeated questions about allowed use, inconsistent approval patterns, or repeated mistakes that indicate people do not understand the rules. When training is weak, teams often develop informal rules that may conflict with governance, creating hidden risk. Separation of duties is a workforce control that often erodes when AI accelerates work because people try to streamline steps to keep up. Separation of duties means the person who benefits from a decision is not the only person who approves it, which reduces conflicts of interest and reduces the chance of self-approval errors. In AI-enabled processes, a builder might adjust how a tool is used and also approve its deployment, or a team might approve its own exception requests without independent review. This can happen simply because the process feels too slow, not because anyone is acting maliciously. Beginners should notice that independence is a safety feature, especially for high-impact uses. If the workflow does not preserve an independent review step for the most consequential decisions, the chance of unchecked risk acceptance rises. Spotting this gap involves checking whether approvals and sign-offs come from roles with genuine authority and independence, not just from whoever is available. When independence disappears, governance becomes performative. Another gap shows up when documentation and decision trails are treated as optional, especially in fast-moving AI projects. Teams may move quickly and rely on informal communication, assuming they will remember why choices were made. Later, when a decision is questioned or a harm occurs, the organization may be unable to explain what was approved, what conditions were required, or what evidence supported the decision. That inability is not just inconvenient. It is a control gap because it prevents accountability and learning. Beginners should understand that documentation is not meant to slow teams down, but to preserve clarity and consistency over time. If a process requires reviews, approvals, or monitoring, but does not require recording those actions in a consistent way, the process cannot be audited or improved. Spotting this gap means looking for missing artifacts, such as approvals that cannot be traced to criteria or conditions that were never verified. When decision trails are missing, the organization loses its ability to defend its choices and improve systematically. Workforce control gaps can also emerge from the environment around the team, including incentives and performance metrics that push behavior in unsafe directions. If people are rewarded for volume, speed, or output quantity, they may rely more heavily on AI and check less carefully. If managers are rewarded for shipping quickly, they may treat governance steps as obstacles instead of safeguards. Beginners should notice that incentives are part of the control system, because they shape how people actually behave when policies are not watching. A process can have strong written rules and still fail if the incentives punish compliance. Spotting this gap means asking whether the organization's performance expectations make it realistic for people to follow review, escalation, and documentation requirements. If the answer is no, then the process is not truly controlled, because it depends on people choosing to take personal risk to do the right thing. Addressing incentive gaps is not about being soft. It is about aligning the system so safe behavior is sustainable. To spot workforce control gaps effectively, you need a habit of comparing the old workflow to the new AI-enabled workflow and asking what safety checks were removed, weakened, or made unrealistic. The old workflow may have had natural verification because people created the work themselves. The new workflow may require explicit verification because the first draft is automated. The old workflow may have had clear ownership because a specific person made decisions. The new workflow may spread decision influence across tools, reviewers, and managers, making ownership less obvious. The old workflow may have had slower pace that allowed reflection. The new workflow may increase pace, making reflection harder unless it is built into the process. Beginners should see that the question is not whether AI is good or bad, but whether the process has been redesigned to stay safe at the new speed. When redesign does not happen, gaps appear, and those gaps are predictable and preventable. A practical way to connect this back to measurable risk management is to remember that workforce control gaps increase likelihood and duration of harm, even when technical systems are stable. Weak review increases the likelihood that incorrect outputs are acted on. Unclear decision boundaries increase the likelihood that high-impact actions happen without safeguards. Missing training increases the likelihood of misuse and data exposure. Weak monitoring increases the duration of harm because problems are detected later. Missing documentation increases the impact of scrutiny because the organization cannot defend its actions or learn reliably. Beginners should notice that each gap maps directly to risk dimensions, which makes it easier to prioritize fixes. Not every gap requires a massive program to fix, but every gap should be acknowledged and addressed in proportion to the harm it could cause. When you treat workforce controls as real controls, you stop assuming people will compensate for weak processes through effort alone. The central takeaway is that new AI-enabled processes often create workforce control gaps because work shifts faster than governance habits. And those gaps show up in review quality, decision boundaries, data handling, change control, ownership, monitoring, training, independence, documentation, and incentives. Spotting these gaps requires looking at workflows honestly and asking where the new process relies on assumptions that are not supported by time, clarity, or authority. A well-controlled AI process is not defined only by the model's capabilities, but by whether people have clear roles, realistic checkpoints, reliable escalation paths, and evidence that key decisions were made responsibly. When you can identify the gaps, you can choose targeted mitigations that restore guardrails without blocking productivity. That is how workforce-focused governance keeps AI adoption from turning into uncontrolled automation that increases harm while everyone believes they are simply being efficient.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit DailyCyber.News.